Book 4, Chapter 7 of the Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane, by Alain René Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 7. Gil Blas leaves his place and goes into the service of Don Gonzales Pacheco. 3 weeks after marriage, my mistress bethought herself of rewarding the services I had rendered her. She made me a present of 100 pistoles, telling me at the same time, Gil Blas, my good fellow, it is not that I mean to turn you away, for you have my free leave to stay here as long as you please, but my husband has an uncle, Don Gonzales Pacheco, who wants you very much for a valet de chambre. I have given you so excellent a character that he would let me have no peace till I consented to part with you. He is a very worthy old nobleman, so that you will be quite in your element in his family. I thanked Aurora for all her kindness, and as my occupation was over about her, I so much the more readily accepted the post that offered, as it was merely a transfer from one branch of the Pachecos to another. One morning, therefore, I called on the illustrious Don Gonzales with a message from the bride. He ought at least to have overslept himself, for he was in bed at near noon. When I went into his chamber, a page had just brought him a basin of soup which he was taking. The dotard cherished his whiskers, or rather tortured them with curling papers. Though his eyes were sunk in their sockets, his complexion pale, and his visage emaciated. This was one of those old codgers who have been a little whimsical or so in their youth, and have made poor amends for their freedoms by the discretion of their riper age. His reception of me was affable enough, with an assurance that if my attachment to him kept pace with my fidelity to his niece, my condition should not be worse than that of my fellows. I promised to place him in my late mistress's shoes, and became the working partner in a new firm. A new firm it undoubtedly was, and heaven knows we had a strange head of the house. The resurrection of Lazarus was an ordinary event compared to his getting up. Imagine to yourself a long bag of dry bones, a mere skeleton, a dissection, an anatomy of a man, a study in osteology. As for the legs, 3 or 4 pair of stockings, one over the other, had no room to make any figure upon them. In addition to the foregoing, this mummy before death was asthmatic, and therefore obliged to divide the little breath he had between his cough and his loquacity. He breakfasted on chocolate. On the strength of that refreshment, he ventured to call for pen, ink, and paper, and to write a short note, which he sealed and sent to its address by the page who had administered the broth. "But this henceforth will be your office, my good lad," said he, as he turned his haggard eyes upon me. "All my little concerns will be in your hands, and especially those in which Donna Euphrasia takes an interest. That lady is an enchanting young creature, with whom I am distractedly in love, and by whom, though I say it who should not say it, I am met with all the mutual ardour of inextinguishable and unutterable passion." Heaven defend us, thought I within myself. Good now, if this old antidote to rapture can fancy himself an object on which the fair should waste their sweets, is it any wonder that among our young folks each fancies himself the Adonis, for whom every Venus pines? "Gil Blas," pursued he with a chuckle, "this very day will I take you to this abode of pleasure. It is my house of call almost every evening for a bit of supper. You will be quite petrified at her modest appearance and the rigid propriety of her behaviour. Far from taking after those little wanton vagrants who are Hago mad after striplings, and give themselves up to the fascinations of exterior appearance, she has a proper insight into things, staid, ripe, and judicious. What she wants is the bona fide spirit and discretion of a man, a lover who has served an apprenticeship to his trade, in preference to all the flashy fellows of the modern school. This is but an epitome of the panegyric which the noble Duke Don Gonzales pronounced upon his mistress. He burdened himself with the task of proving her a compendium of all human perfection, but the lecture was little calculated for the conviction of the hearer. I had attended an experimental course among the actresses, and had always found that the elderly candidates had been plucked in their amours. Yet, as a matter of courtesy, it was impossible not to put on the semblance of giving implicit credit to my master's veracity. I even added chivalry to courtesy, and threw down my glove on Euphrasia's penetration and the correctness of her taste. My impudence went the length of asserting that it was impossible for her to have selected a better provided crony. The grown-up simpleton was not aware that I was fumigating his nostrils at the expense of his addled brain. On the contrary, he bristled at my praises. So true is it that a flatterer may play what game he likes against the pigeons of high life. They let you look over their hand, and then wonder that you beat them. The old crawler, having scribbled through his billet doux, restrained the luxuriance of a straggling hair or two with his tweezers, then bathed his eyes in the nostrum of some perfumer to give them a brilliancy which their natural gum would have eclipsed. His ears were to be picked and washed, and his hands to be cleansed from the effects of his other ablutions, and the labours of the toilette were to be closed by penciling every remaining hair in the deforested domain of his whiskers, pericranium, and eyebrows. No old dowager with a purse to buy a second husband ever took more pains to assure herself, by the cultivation of her charms, that the person and not the fortune should be the object of attraction. The assassin's stab of time was parried by the quart and tierce of art. Just as he had done making himself up, in came another old fogram of his acquaintance, by name the Count of Asumar. This genius made no secret of his grey locks, leant upon a stick, and seemed to plume himself on his venerable age, instead of wishing to appear in the heyday of his prime. Signor Pacheco, said he as he came in, I am come to take pot luck with you to-day. You are always welcome, Count, rejoined my master. No sooner said than done. They embraced with 1,000 grimaces, took their seats opposite to one another, and began chatting till dinner was served. Their conversation turned at first upon a bull feast which had taken place a few days before. They talked about the cavaliers, and who among them had displayed most dexterity and vigour, whereupon the old count, like another Nestor, whom present events furnish with a topic of expatiating on the past, said with a deep-drawn sigh, Alas, where will you meet with men nowadays fit to hold a candle to my contemporaries? The public diversions are a mere bauble to what they were when I was a young man. I could not help chuckling in my sleeve at my good lord of Asumar's whim, for he did not stop at the handiwork of human invention. Would you believe it? At table, when the fruit was brought in, at the sight of some very fine peaches, this ungrateful consumer of the earth's produce exclaimed, In my time the peaches were of a much larger size than they are now, but nature sinks lower and lower from day to day. If that is the case, said Don Gonzales with a sneer, Adam's hothouse fruit must have been of a most unwieldy circumference. The Count of Asumar stayed still quite evening with my master, who had no sooner got rid of him than he sallied forth with me in his train. We went to Euphrasia's, who lived within a stone's throw of our house, and found her lodged in a style of the first elegance. She was tastefully dressed, and for the youthfulness of her air might have been taken to be in her teens, though 30 bonny summers at least had poured their harvests in her lap. She had often been reckoned pretty, and her wit was exquisite. Neither was she one of your brazen-faced jilts, with nothing but flimsy balderdash in their talk, and a libertine forwardness in their manners. Here was modesty of carriage as well as propriety of discourse. and she threw out her little sallies in the most exquisite manner, without seeming to aspire beyond natural good sense. Oh heaven! said I, is it possible that a creature of so virtuous a stamp by nature should have abandoned herself to vicious courses for a livelihood? I had taken it for granted that all women of light character carried the mark of the beast upon their foreheads. It was a surprise, therefore, to see such apparent rectitude of conduct. Neither did it occur to me that these hacks were all customers could go at any pace, and assume the polish of well-bred society, to impose upon their cullies of the higher ranks. What if a lively petulance should be the order of the day? They are lively and petulant. Should modesty take its turn in the round of fashion, nothing can exceed their outward show of prudent and delicate reserve. They play the comedy of love in many masks, and are the prude, the coquette, or the virago, as they fall in with the quiz, the coxcomb, or the bully. Don Gonzales was a gentleman and a man of taste. He could not stomach those beauties who call a spade a spade. Such were not for his market. The rites of Venus must be consummated in the temple of Vesta. Euphrasia had got up her part accordingly, and proved by her performance that there is no comedy like that of real life. I left my master, like another Numa, with his Egeria, and went down into a hall, where whom should fortune throw in my way but an old Abigail, whom I had formerly known as maid of all work to an actress. The recognition was mutual. So, well met once more, Signor Gil Blas, said she. Then you have turned off Arsenia, just as I have parted with Constance? Yes, truly, answered I. It is a long while ago since I went away, and exchanged her service for that of a very different lady. Neither the theatre nor the people about it are to my taste. I gave myself my own discharge, without condescending to the slightest explanation with Arsenia. You were perfectly in the right, replied the new-found Abigail, called Beatrice. That was pretty much my method of proceeding with Constance. One morning early I gave in my accounts with a very sulky air. She took them from me in moody silence, and we parted in a sort of well-bred dudgeon. I am quite delighted, said I, that we have met again, where we need not be ashamed of our employers. Donna Euphrasia looks for all the world like a woman of fashion, and I am much deceived if she has not reputation too. You are too clear-sighted to be deceived, answered the old appendage to sin. She is of a good family, and as for her temper, I can assure you it is unparalleled for evenness and sweetness. None of your termagant mistresses, never to be pleased, but always grumbling and scolding about everything, making the house ring with their clack, and fretting poor servants to a thread, whose places, in short, are a hell upon earth. I have not in all this time heard her raise her voice on any occasion whatever. When things happen not to be done exactly in her way, she sets them to rights without any anger, nor does any of that bad language escape her lips, of which some high-spirited ladies are so liberal. My master, too, rejoined I, is very mild in his disposition, the very milk of human kindness, and in this respect we are, between ourselves, much better off than when we lived among the actresses. 1,000 times better, replied Beatrice. My life used to be all bustle and distraction, but this place is an actual hermitage. Not a creature darkens our doors but this excellent Don Gonzales. You will be my only helpmate in my solitude, and my lot is but too greatly blessed. For this long time have I cherished an affection for you, and many a time and oft have I begrudged that Laura the felicity of engrossing you for her sweetheart, but in the end I hope to be even with her. If I cannot boast of youth and beauty like hers to balance the account, I detest coquetry, and have all the constancy as well as affection of a turtle dove. As honest Beatrice was one of those ladies who are obliged to hawk their wares, and cheapen themselves for want of cheapeners in the market, I was happily shielded from any temptation to break the commandments. Nevertheless, it might not have been prudent to let her see in what contempt her charms were held. for which reason I forced my natural politeness so far as to talk to her in a style not to cut off all hope of my more serious advances. I flattered myself then that I had found favour in the eyes of an old dresser to the stage, but pride was destined to have a fall, even on so humble an occasion. The domestic trickster did not sharpen her allurements from any longing for my pretty person. Her design in subduing me to the little soft god was to enlist me for the purposes of her mistress, to whom she had sworn so passive an obedience that she would have sold her eternal self to the old chapman who first set up the trade of sin, rather than have disappointed her slightest wishes. My vain conceit was sufficiently evident on the very next morning, when I carried an Ovidian letter from my master to Euphrasia. The lady gave me an affable reception, and made 1,000 pretty speeches, echoed from the practised lips of her chambermaid. The expression of my countenance was peculiarly interesting to the one, but that within which passeth show was the flattering theme of the other. According to their account, the fortunate Don Gonzales had picked up a treasure. In short, my praises ran so high that I began to think worse of myself than I had ever done in the whole course of my life. Their motive was sufficiently obvious, but I was determined to play at diamond cut diamond. The simper of a simpleton is no bad countermine to the attack of a sharper. These ladies under favour were of the latter description, and they soon began to open their batteries. Hark you, Gil Blas, said Euphrasia, fortune declares in your favour if you do not balk her. Let us put our heads together, my good friend. Don Gonzales is old, and a good deal shaken in constitution, so that a very little fever in the hands of a very good doctor would carry him to a better place. Let us take time by the forelock, and ply our arts so busily as to secure to me the largest slice of his effects. If I prosper, you shall not starve, I promise you, and my bare word is a better security than all the deeds and conveyances of all the lawyers in Madrid. Madam, answered I, you have but to command me. Give me my commission on your muster roll, and you shall have no reason to complain either of my cowardice or contumacy. So be it then, replied she. You must watch your master, and bring me an account of all his comings and goings. When you are chatting together in his more familiar moments, never fail to lead the conversation on the subject of our sex, and then by an artful but seemingly natural transition take occasion to say all the good you can invent of me. Ring Euphrasia in his ears till all the house re-echoes. I would counsel you besides to keep a wary eye on all that passes in the Pacheco family. If you catch any relation of Don Gonzales sneaking about him, with a design on the inheritance, bring me word instantly. That is all you have to do, and trust me for sinking, burning, and destroying him in less than no time. I have ferreted out the weak side of all your master's relations long ago. They are each of them to be made ridiculous in some shape or other, so that the nephews and cousins, after sitting to me for their portraits, are already turned with their faces to the wall. It was evident by these instructions, with many more to the same time and tune, that Euphrasia was one of those ladies whose partialities all lean to the side of elderly inamoratos with more money than wit. Not long ago, Don Gonzales, who could refuse nothing to the tender passion, had sold an estate, and she pocketed the cash. Not a day passed but she got some little personal remembrance out of him, and besides all this, a corner of his will was the ultimate object of her speculation. I affected to engage hand over head in their infamous plot, and if I must confess all without mental reservation, it was almost a moot point on my return home on which side of the cause I should take a brief. There was on either a profitable alternative, whether to join in fleecing my master, or to merit his gratitude by rescuing him from the plunderers. Conscience, however, seemed to have some little concern in the determination. it was quite ridiculous to choose the bypath of villainy when there was a better toll to be taken on the highway of honesty. Besides, Euphrasia had dealt too much in generals. An arithmetical definition of so much for so much has more meaning in it than all the wealth of the Indies, and to this shrewd reflection perhaps was owing my uncorrupted probity. Thus did I resolve to signalize my zeal in the service of Don Gonzales, in the persuasion that if I was lucky enough to disgust the worshipper by befouling his idol, it would turn to very good account. On a statement of debtor and creditor, between the right and the wrong side of the action, the money balance was visibly in favour of virtue, not to mention the delights of a fair and irreproachable character. If vice so often assumes the semblance of its contrary, why should not hypocrisy now and then change sides for variety? I held myself up to Euphrasia for a thorough swindler. She was dupe enough to believe that I was incessantly talking of her to my master, and thereupon I wove a tissue of frippery and falsehood, which imposed on her for sterling truth. She had so completely given herself up to my insinuations as to believe me her convert, her disciple, her confederate. The better still to carry on this fraud upon fraud, I affected to languish for Beatrice, and she, in ecstasy at her age to see a young fellow at her skirts, did not much trouble herself about my sincerity, if I did but play my part with vigour and address. When we were in the presence of our princesses, my master in the parlour and myself in the kitchen, the effect was that of two different pictures, but of the same school. Don Gonzales, dry as touchwood, with all its inflammability and nothing but its smother, seemed a fitter subject for extreme unction than for amorous parley; while my little pet, in proportion to the violence of my flame, niggled, nudged, toyed, and romped like a schoolgirl in vacation. And no wonder she knew her lesson so pat, for the old coquette had been upwards of 40 years in the form. She had finished her studies under certain professors of gallantry, whose art of pleasing becomes the more critical by practice, till they die under the accumulated experience of 2 or 3 generations. It was not enough for me to go every evening with my master to Euphrasia's, it was sometimes my lounge even in daytime. But let me pop my head in at what hour I would, that forbidden creature, man, was never there, nor even a woman of any description that might not be just as easily expressed as understood. There was not the least loophole for a paramour, a circumstance not a little perplexing to one who could not readily believe that so pretty a bale of goods could submit to a strict monopoly by such a dealer as Don Gonzales. This opinion undoubtedly was formed on a near acquaintance with female nature, as will be apparent in this sequel, for the fair Euphrasia, while waiting for my master's translation, fortified herself with patience in the arms of a lover, with some little fellow feeling for the frailties of her age. One morning I was carrying, according to custom, a note to this peerless pattern of perfection. There certainly were, or I was not standing in the room, the feet of a man ensconced behind the tapestry. Out slunk I, just as if I had no eyes in my head. Yet, though such a discovery was nothing but what might have been expected, neither was the piper to be paid out of my pocket. My feelings were a good deal staggered at the breach of faith. Ah, traitress, exclaimed I with virtuous indignation, abandon Euphrasia. Not satisfied to humbug a silly old gentleman with a tale of love, you share his property in your person with another, and add profligacy to dissimulation. But to be sure, on afterthoughts, I was but a greenhorn when I took on for such a trivial occurrence. It was rather a subject for mirth than for moral reflection, and perfectly justified by the way of the world. The languid, embargoed commerce of my master's amorous moments had need be filliped by a trade in some more merchantable wares. At all events, it would have been better to have held my tongue than to have laid hold on such an opportunity of playing the faithful servant. But instead of tempering my zeal with discretion, nothing would serve the turn but taking up the wrongs of Don Gonzales in the spirit of chivalry. On this high principle I made a circumstantial report of what I had seen, with the addition of the attempt made by Euphrasia to seduce me from my good faith. I gave it in her own words without the least reserve, and put him in the way of knowing all that was to be known of his mistress. He was struck all in a heap by my intelligence, and a faint flash of indignation on his faded cheek seemed to give security that the lady's infidelity would not go unpunished. Enough, Gil Blas, said he. I am infinitely obliged by your attachment to my service, and your probity is very acceptable to me. I will go to Euphrasia this very moment. I will overwhelm her with reproaches, and break at once with the ungrateful creature. With these words he actually bent his way to the subject of his anger, and dispensed with my attendance, from the kind motive of sparing me the awkwardness which my presence during their explanation would have occasioned to my feelings. I longed for my master's return with all the impatience of an interested person. There could not be a doubt but that with his strong grounds of complaint he would return completely disentangled from the snares of his nymph. In this thought I extolled and magnified myself for my good deed. What could be more flattering than the thanks of the kindred who were naturally to inherit after Don Gonzales, when they should be informed that their relative was no longer the puppet of a figure dance so hostile to their interests? It was not to be supposed but that such a friend would be remembered, and that my merits would at last be distinguished from those of other serving men, who are usually more disposed to encourage their masters in licentiousness than to draw them off to habits of decency. I was always of an aspiring temper, and thought to have passed for the Joseph or the Scipio of the servants' hall, but so fascinating an idea was only to be indulged for an hour or two. The founder of my fortunes came home. My friend, said he, I've had a very sharp brush with Euphrasia. She insists on it that you have trumped up a cock and bull story. If their word is to be taken, you are no better than an impostor, a hireling in the pay of my nephews, for whose sake you have set all your wits at work to bring about a quarrel between her and me. I have seen the real tears made of water run down in floods from her poor dear eyes. She has vowed to me as solemnly as if I had been her confessor, that she never made any overtures to you in her life, and that she does not know what man is. Beatrice, who seems a simple, innocent sort of girl, is exactly in the same story, so that I could not but believe them and be pacified, whether I would or no. How then, sir, interrupted I, in accents of undissembled sorrow, do you question my sincerity? Do you distrust? No, my good lad, interrupted he again in his turn, I will do you ample justice. I do not suspect you of being in league with my nephews. I am satisfied that all you have done has been for my good, and own myself much obliged to you for it. But appearances are apt to mislead, so that perhaps you did not see in reality what you took it into your head that you saw, and in that case only consider yourself how offensive your charge must be to Euphrasia. Yet let that be as it will, she is a creature whom I cannot help loving in spite of my senses, so that the sacrifice she demands must be made, and that sacrifice is no less than your dismission. I lament it very much, my poor dear Gil Blas, and if that will be any satisfaction to you, my consent was wrung from me most unwillingly, but there was no saying nay. With one thing, however, you may comfort yourself, you shall not be sent away with empty pockets. Nay, more, I mean to turn you over to a lady of my acquaintance, where you will live to your liking. I was not a little mortified to find all my noble acts and motives end in my own confusion. I gave a left-handed blessing to Euphrasia, and wept over the weakness of Don Gonzales to be so foolishly infatuated by her. The kind-hearted old gentleman felt within himself that in turning me adrift at the peremptory demand of his mistress, he was not performing the most manly action of his life. For this reason, as a set off against his hen-pecked cowardice, and that I might the more easily swallow this bitter dose, he gave me 50 ducats, and took me with him next morning to the Marchioness of Chaves, telling that lady before my face that I was a young man of unexceptionably good character, and very high in his good graces, but that certain family reasons prevented him from continuing me on his own establishment. He should esteem it as a favour if she would take me on hers. After such an introduction, I was retained at once as her appendage, and found myself, I scarcely knew how, established in another household. End of Book 4, Chapter 7.